Good morning. We are live. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for joining.
All right.
And yeah, Micah's here as well. And you can see we're in a slightly different configuration because everything's always changing all the time. But we are here. We are here to talk to you all about OAuth today. So, um, I would love to know who we've got on the stream. I see some people here, so that's awesome. Do me a favor, join chat and just type something in the chat and say where you are coming from. Say where in the world you are joining from today, and hopefully we should see that pop up on the map. Hello, hello. It must have found a place called guys, but go ahead and say the city name you're joining from. From India, awesome. Ireland, Ontario, from Poland. Anatoly is from Poland. Micah is in Farmingville. I am in Portland, Oregon. This is great. Yusuf from San Jose. Oh, Malmo. I want to go back to Malmo. Haven't been there a long time now. This is great. We've got almost all the continents covered. This is not a good time for Australia right now, so they're in the middle of the night, so probably nobody from there. Awesome. So thanks all for joining. We have a fun agenda today. We've got a couple of topics in mind that we're going to talk about. Have a little thing we're going to try around a little experiment, maybe. That's what we're going to call it. See how it goes. And of course, happy to answer any questions from you all here in the chat. So feel free to type questions in any time, and we'll get to them when we can. But yeah, that was a fun intro. Thanks all for playing along with the map game. All right, so what do we got on the docket this week, Micah? Where should we start?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a couple things we wanted to talk about. One was an idea of mine, which is frankly self-serving, and that is I came up with a little OAuth game that we do in our workshops. And this is something that we previously had done live. We would get people to kind of dress up in silly costumes and act out an OAuth flow. And once we started going remote, I didn't want to lose the fun of that segment, so I made this little gamified version of it, and it's intended to be, multiplayer, lots of games going at once potentially, in case Aaron and I or others are doing workshops at the same time. And on our very first OAuth happy hour, we showed off this little game, but we did it in a very controlled kind of way where we had one game going at the same time and everybody was kind of looking at the same thing. And I thought maybe today we would use everybody that's connected to try and fire up multiple games and just see if the system falls over or not. So it may go down in flames or it may just work. But we could start there if you want. Check out OAuth Theater. I'll put the link in the chat here.
Cool. Yeah,
And
so if you go to that link,
I'll share my
we'll show
screen.
that on the screen.
Yeah.
This is a real website. It looks like it's one of those funny domains where the end is longer than the domain part. .theater.
Yeah, now everything's a
Oh,
TLD.
there we
Sorry.
go.
So this is the waiting room. No game started yet. I'm gonna start a game, and I'll start it as a player.
I'll jump in as
And then on
well.
another, great. And then on another screen, um, if I can find where I put it, I thought on another screen, bear with me a sec. I'm going to go to the same site, and I'll just monitor to see if there's additional games going, because once you get to the waiting room, you can see if other games are started. So other people should feel free to start a game, but you do, in order to play the game, you really need four people in a game. So I see we now have 3 games going. Two of them have Pats, and the middle one has no players yet. Once you're in the game, once you join the game, you move your character that's assigned to you using the arrows. So it looks like in this game we have Pat and Yelp. I'm Pat. Somebody else is Yelp.
Oh, I'm
the
Yelp
one that's
in that
showing
one.
on my screen right now. Okay, cool.
That's me. So
And
2 more
then
of you can join.
there we go. Okay, so it looks like, yeah, so, and each game has a name. One's called Sore Glove. One's called Hellish Air. There's one called Dead Earth. Maybe I need to look
Wow.
at some of these
These
names. It's just, I know, it's just picking from a random set of names, and it looks like the server's getting a little dark today. I'll have to look at my dictionary list. But once you are in the game, there's always a goal at the bottom. So the first goal is Pat goes to Yelp, and you should see like a little spinny Sims kind of thing over your character. So as you move the arrows around, you'll see the little green spinny diamond over your character, but then everybody else can move independently. It's being reasonably responsive for me. I don't know how it is for everybody else. We still have 3 games. It looks like Sore Glove almost has a complete set of users. There we go. So Sore Glove now has a complete set of users, so we could actually play the game. So the first, it kind of slowed down for me. It's a little sluggish. So
I see
I'll
a
have to look
couple
at
of
that. Oh,
skipping.
then it's sped up again. Yeah, it's sped up again. It took a little bit. So now I can go to Yelp, maybe, if Yelp doesn't run away from me. And now Yelp
Oh,
asks me a question.
would you like to connect your contacts?
All right, and so now it's telling Pat to press the space bar. So I say, yes, I would.
And I say, I press the space bar. All right, go over to Google to authorize me.
Okay, so now I press the space bar, and now the next goal is Pat goes to Google. So now I have to run over to Google. Now somebody is in this game that's on my screen is Google. There we go. Google's moving around. Nice. So now I go to Google. Now Google, ordinarily when we're doing this in a workshop, people would be assigned these roles and they would say the lines out loud, but Aaron and I are the only ones on mic here, so I'll just say it. So Google says, credentials please, and I say, here you go. And now I've passed my credentials over to Google. Now Google has to press the space bar in order to continue. So let's see, whoever our Google character is, go ahead and press your space bar.
Oh, and I just realized that the stream is going to be a little bit delayed.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that part. I did forget about that part. All right. So I'm going to shut up for a second, and Google press the space bar when it gets there.
Should be only a couple seconds.
Yeah. Now, one of the nice things, at least from the perspective of Aaron and I running these workshops, is that we can assume the identity of any of these characters. So the player gets stuck or what have you, we can keep the action flowing. So I'm going to assume the identity of Google here for a second, and I'll press the space bar as Google. And now Google says, do you consent to Yelp having read-only access to your contacts? All right, so then as Pat, I press the space bar and I say, yes, I'll allow it. And now I've given my consent over to Google. So Google now has all of these tokens, or not, I don't want to use the word token, props attached to it. So Google now has all these props. So Google presses the space bar and says, very well, take this authorization code to Yelp. And so now the goal is for Pat to deliver the code over to Yelp. So I'm going to chase Yelp
I don't know
around
why I
here.
always feel like I need to run away.
Here's the code from Google, I say.
Thanks. All right, time to go get an access token. Now I have to chase down Google. And I say, hey, Google, I've got an authorization code. I would like to exchange it for an access token, please.
Okay, then Google will press the space bar. Hopefully there's not too much of a delay. I can take over again if need be.
Yeah, it depends on what YouTube is set to, because it might be up to 20 seconds, depending on how we've got this set up.
Yeah. Oh, there's Google. All right, Google's moving around,
Awesome.
so that's good. So Google can press the space bar, in theory. It's not too bad. It looks like it's just a couple seconds. I'm looking at the YouTube on the other screen.
Oh, nice. Okay.
All right, I'm gonna press the space bar for Google. So Google says, give me the code and your secret so I know it's really Yelp. So now Yelp is up again. The instruction is for Yelp to press the space bar.
Oh, that's me. Okay.
Google says that is a good code. Here's an access token.
And I've got the access token. Cool. Okay. Successfully exchanged that code for an access token. Now I can go over to the contacts API. Did our dialogue get out of sync?
It might have. That'll be something for me to check.
Contacts API says, cool, I'm going to go validate that token. I'll get out of the way.
All right. So, yeah. So now contacts goes over there.
I think we're out of sync.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see something different than what's on your screen.
Oh, interesting. All right.
I don't see that dialog box that's up right now.
I said it might go down in flames, so I'll have to look at the log and see how it got out of sync. But contacts is saying Yelp wants to read Pat's contacts. Is this a good token? And then Google says that is a good token. And now the contacts API is going to go back to Yelp.
Here's a list of Pat's contacts, and I will take it. I got the contacts, and I am going to spam all of Pat's friends now. Wow. Cool.
All right. Cool. Well, that was useful. At the end of the day, we only had one active game going. I'll stop sharing my screen. But it was useful to see, you know, the interplay there with actual remote people, and it looks like at one point we got out of sync, so I have to see what's going on there.
But
turns out it's a little more difficult than you might think.
Yes. Real-time game programming. So a question from Yusuf, is there any point in the authorization code being different from the access token? So yeah, the reason, this is actually, this is a really important question, really, this is like core to the understanding of OAuth. So I was actually just doing a workshop earlier today, and I decided to completely throw away my normal plan and do everything differently. And what I did was a like interactive like working through building up to these concepts in OAuth. So we started off where like I made people come off of mute on Zoom. People hate doing that. And actually like play these roles, but instead of going through a script, what I did was I said, okay, you're the user, you're the API, and then you're the application. Your job is to go show the bank balance to the user. And I made people like figure out, given those tools, what could they do? And we started off with pre-OAuth of like basically HTTP basic auth. So what happens when you use HTTP basic auth? Well, the user gives their password to the application. The application gives their password to the API. The API responds with the data. And then we talked about what's wrong with that. Like, where are the problems with this flow? And everybody pretty quickly figured out all the different reasons that's a terrible idea, which is why we don't use HTTP basic auth. Okay. Then we upgraded to, well, let's at least introduce the concept of an authorization server so that we don't share passwords with the API. So the API doesn't have to have passwords. And by using the authorization server as this extra step, we walk through the exercise again, and it turns out that's actually now the OAuth password grant. And it's better than basic auth, but it still has a few critical problems, right? Mainly that I had to give the user has to give their password to the application and just sort of trust that the application doesn't store it and trust that it handles it properly. And we talked through that. And then we added a new step, which is this idea of going through a redirect. And if you just do the smallest addition from that, the next step up would be the implicit grant, which we've talked many times in this series about what's wrong with the implicit grant. And it turns out that it's pretty apparent when you walk through these steps what the problems are. And the main problem with the implicit grant gets to this question that Yusuf was asking, which is that so the OAuth server is going to generate this access token, but it can't deliver it directly to the app. It actually delivers it to the user, and the user takes it to the app, which means there's two problems. There's the OAuth server doesn't actually know if it was received by the application, if it actually got there. The OAuth server has no visibility into whether it worked or whether it got stolen or copied or anything. Secondly, the application that gets this access token, it's getting it from the user, not from the OAuth server. So it has no idea if it's actually a legitimate access token from the OAuth server or if it's something from somebody else or from an attacker or what, it has no idea, no way to tell. So we're kind of missing two halves of, missing information on both sides of that exchange. So that's why we add the authorization code. Once we add the authorization code, we can plug that up. So what the authorization code does is the authorization code is issued the same way the access token would be in the implicit grant, right? Where it's sent back in the redirect. So the OAuth server still can't be sure that the authorization code was delivered. And that's bad, but that's not the access token. The only thing that can do is be used to get an access token. And the way it's used to get an access token is by the application bringing it back to the OAuth server, along with the application's client secret. And if you're doing PXE, which you should be, then you also have to include the PXE code verifier, which then plugs up the holes on both sides of that. So that's the reason for that extra step, which seems a little bit like, it seems redundant unless you actually go through and start looking at why we have each step of these along the way. So hopefully that makes sense.
Well, one thing I would add there, Aaron, great overview, by the way, is the authorization code is meant to be one-time use and has a very short window that you can only do the one thing you can do with it. So at Okta, it's 5 minutes. I think that actual timeout is left up to the implementation, but it should be very short. So
it's like 30 seconds on Okta, because when I do the demos, by the time I've tried to make a change to my code, the authorization code's already expired. It's very short.
Oh, great. Yeah. And that's the way it should be, right? Because it should be exchanged very quickly, and that's all it can be used for is the exchange. So that mitigates some of the potential problems with the fact that it, is coming in the front channel and could be intercepted.
Yep, exactly. So that's the reason why there's the extra authorization code. It's because that is returned in the front channel in a way that neither side can really trust that it's legitimate at that point. And then you can use a trusted channel along with additional authentication to actually get the access token using that code. Cool. So here's a question. I like this question. Should you allow your authorization page to be embedded in Iframe? Are there cores or whitelisting recommendations around this? So you really should never let your authorization page be embedded in an iframe. And the reason is because iframes are not really verifiable by the user. So browsers have gone through a lot of trouble to set things up such that users have the ability to know that they're really on the real OAuth server's page, right? So when you go to a website and visit it with an HTTPS address, you get a little lock icon in the address bar. You see the domain name. Safari's even gone so far as to only show you the domain and not show you the URL unless you click into it. So it's really just like highlighting this is the domain you're on. There's that lock icon, which is the SSL verification, and all of that is only done on that top page. So what it means is that if a web page that you're on is asking you to enter some sort of sensitive information, whether that's a credit card info or a password, you want to know that you are actually entering it into the page that you think you are entering it into. And one of the tools available to you as a user to verify that is the domain name in the address bar and the lock icon. So if you could embed an authorization page in an iframe, then the icon in the address bar, or the URL in the address bar, would be different from that of your authorization server, which means you're going to be on a domain that is not the OAuth server asking you to enter the password for your OAuth server, and you would have no way to verify that the iframe that you're looking at is in fact the real page and not something that's embedded by an attacker. So if you imagine two different applications, if you imagine a legitimate app that's embedded the iframe, and that's fine, but that would look the same as an attacker's app, which they can set up their own SSL cert, and you look at the lock icon, but the attacker's app on a different domain could embed the authorization server there, but then they could also embed a page that looks like the authorization server, that's styled the exact same way, and trick you into entering your bank account login into the attacker's webpage. And the only way to avoid this problem is to teach users to never enter their password anywhere except the real authorization server's domain name. This is phishing. This is like basics of phishing, right? And it's a very hard problem to train users to do anything like that. So we should always make it easy for people to understand and the fewest number of mental steps to verify this stuff. One of the additional things that's happening is using security keys and like the built-in authenticator available on Macs and Windows, and what those are doing is they're creating unphishable credentials, and the reason they're unphishable is because they are actually bound to the domain name that issued them, which means there is no way to share a credential to an attacker. It's just impossible. And once you have that in place, that only works when the address bar is the domain that actually issued the credential. So you really want to make sure you're redirecting to the OAuth server in that case, so that your WebAuthn, your little YubiKey or whatever it is, works. So
the other side of that, the other challenge is from a design perspective. Designers oftentimes hate this idea of redirects. They don't, and marketing people also, they don't want you to ever go away from the brand. They don't want you to ever leave the page. And I've experienced at least that tension where we want to say like the best, safest thing to do is to redirect. And then there are different constituencies that say we don't want to ever redirect. That's bad. And that can be a conflict. But when you do redirect, you get the assurance of, like Aaron was saying, the lock icon, the right domain. You know that you're in the right place where you're putting your credentials. And it's hard to get that same level of assurance if you're not redirecting over to the authorization server.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Cool. So that was a good one. I wish it would like highlight the chat comments when we have answered them.
Right.
How about this
There was an
one?
Okta specific one. Yeah, I'll do that one after this one.
Sure. Can SAML and OAuth be used together? Kind of. So the SAML and OAuth are completely different protocols, and they're actually for very different purposes. The way that you will often see these used together is so the application is trying to get an access token to go access an API. That's not really something SAML is going to do. So it'll do an OAuth flow, but then when you get to the authorization server, if you don't actually have a password for that account because it's a single sign-on account somewhere else, that authorization server might then do a SAML exchange to go and actually identify the user. So you'll often see this where you'll end up getting like bounced around a few times before you end up back at the application. So for example, Google accounts, if you have a like Google for your domain, then it's still a Google account, but Google can then actually, instead of having a password for that account, it can actually delegate to an external identity provider. And it can do that over OpenID Connect or SAML, I'm pretty sure. But that's where you would see that, where you would see those two protocols used together because they're actually solving different purposes. And OAuth doesn't actually say anything about how to authenticate users. OAuth is just about getting access tokens to applications. Users still have to be authenticated in OAuth, but that's the business of the authorization server. And how the authorization server does that doesn't really matter to OAuth. And one way to do that is via SAML, another is password, another is a second like OpenID Connect exchange to somebody else, or whatever you want. The sky is the limit.
Yeah, and other providers, including Okta, do something similar to what Aaron's describing with Google, where you can define an external identity provider that integrates with Okta. That could be Google, or it could be a pure SAML provider. And then once you authenticate with that external provider, you can then switch over to OAuth and get tokens and use those tokens to interact with backend APIs. So it's not exactly OAuth and SAML talking to each other. It's kind of like you have something in the middle that's glue that's connecting them in a way that neither one really cares or knows about the other.
Yep. Did you want to take that Okta question, Micah?
Yeah, sure. What does it mean when Okta errors? The authorization server ID is invalid. I'm trying to implement sign-in for my app. There's a thing with Okta, and I always like to say I'm biased because I'm employed by Okta and I like what Okta does, but Okta has a problem when it comes to authorization servers, which is that it can be a little confusing. What I'm describing may be your problem, Yusuf. It's a common problem when people get this error. It may not be, but I'm going to describe this situation, and you can tell me if offline or in comments if this is what you're encountering. So Okta has what it calls an org level authorization server, and that org level authorization server is only good for getting verifying identity for like a global authorization server. It's not the place where you would be minting access tokens. Then Okta also defines a custom authorization server. You can have any number of hosted authorization servers with Okta, but for better or worse, there's one that comes predefined called default. So people get understandably confused between the default custom authorization server and the built-in org level authorization server. So the first thing you might want to check is there the word default in your authorization server issuer URL? Because if there is, that's probably what you want if you're working with a backend API. If all you care about is using the authorization server to have the user sign in, then you don't need that /default as part of the issuer URI. So saying it out, even saying it out loud, it sounds a little confusing. So apologies if you don't understand what I'm talking about. But we find that oftentimes this is the problem. Somebody mints a token with the global authorization server, the org level authorization server, but then they try to validate it with the custom authorization server, and they don't, they're different authorization servers, so they don't work together. If that doesn't answer the question, or if that's not the problem that you're having, feel free to ask another question, or you can @ me on Twitter, and I'll be happy to answer offline. I'll put my Twitter account in here.
Cool.
What else we got?
Is it really important to use OpenID Connect? If you,
I love it.
I know, I love it. If you need to know information about the user, you probably need to use OpenID Connect. So if all you need to do is access an API, then you don't need it at all, because that's what OAuth is for. OAuth is about getting an access token and using the access token to access an API. Now, if your application does need to know about the user, then you'll probably need to use OpenID Connect, because that's what that is for. That's about communicating information about the user to the application. What else we got? Should we talk about some of the other? Do you want to talk about your demo we did last week?
Yeah, sure. So last week I did a demo. It was a practical application of a pretty well documented OAuth attack called the authorization code injection attack. I'm kind of a tinkerer, and I like to get my hands on things, and I hadn't seen a practical application of it. So, I designed an architecture, I validated it with Aaron, and I made an example, and I kind of presented that last week. After that, I posted a video with basically the same demonstration, and then there was a pretty fair amount of conversation around that video about the auth code injection attack, about OAuth attacks in general. And one of the questions that came up a few times was, in the demonstration that I did, the key point of this practical application was that a user had been tricked into installing a malicious browser extension. That was kind of the enabling technology. And so a number of questions were along the lines of, well, if I'm a savvy user and I'm not tricked into installing a browser extension, how could this attack be done a different way? Or is there another way that this attack could be done? And we got some good feedback from Aaron and others about other ways that you could inject code. So that I thought that might be good to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think the reason that we use the browser extension to demonstrate this is because it's a very easy way to demonstrate it. And chances are you do have a browser extension installed. Like most people have at least one. And the point was that you may not even know everything those extensions are doing, right? So it's also just a very easy way to demonstrate it. But what are some other ways that could happen? So DNS spoofing or DNS poisoning, where we normally don't really worry about that too much, except that if you're on like a hotel or airport Wi-Fi with those captive portals, that is an example of DNS spoofing, like that is a part of everyday life. Well, at least everyday life once we get back to traveling. But that's an example of like when you hop onto somebody else's Wi-Fi, it tells you what DNS server to use, and that means it can then reply with whatever it wants. And the way that the captive portals work is it returns a bogus answer into DNS for whatever address you type in. So you can type in whatever you want and you're going to end up on the splash page. And if the timing was such that you had started a login right before that happened, you could end up sending the authorization code to the captive portal page, for example. Right. And you might be wondering, well, you might be saying, well, I'm never going to like log into something right when I open my laptop before I'm on the Wi-Fi. But guess what? I bet you have like 20 tabs open, and I bet some of them are OAuth clients, and some of them might just log in themselves. So for example, like I have, I always leave Outlook in a tab open, and I've multiple times opened up my laptop to find that page has just turned white because it's tried to start an OAuth flow to refresh a token, and it's failed partway through, probably because my laptop like resumed without a network connection and like woke up for a few seconds, long enough for it to register that it's going to try to refresh it. But if you open up your laptop and you hop onto a Wi-Fi and it's busy thinking, oh, I'm going to go try to refresh this right now. So there's that's another reason that could happen.
One other thing along those lines too, Aaron, is you might be surprised that your own internet provider at your home or your place of work, you might be surprised what your DNS settings end up actually being. I use Verizon Fios. I'm happy with their service, but I typed in a wrong URL one day and I got a Verizon error page. And I was like, oh, I guess Verizon is managing the DNS on this connection because they can send me a custom error page. That was a little spooky, and people may not even be aware. So you might be surprised, what's happening behind the scenes with your even regular internet connection.
Yep, definitely. That's actually one of the reasons that a few of the there's this move towards DNS over HTTPS. So something like Firefox, I think, is shipping now by default using Cloudflare's DNS over HTTP. And the idea there is that you use an encrypted connection to make the DNS request so that it can't be spoofed to prevent that exact situation from happening. So that you always use your own known DNS servers regardless of whose Wi-Fi you're on. I like this comment, thanks. Last week's demo on the extension was amazing. I only used a few extensions, but after carefully inspecting the permissions, it was quite a learning experience, and I have 0 now. So uninstalled all your extensions after that. I mean, yeah, a lot of the extensions just request global permissions to be able to modify everything because, but then maybe they're doing something legitimate. Like I have an extension here that's like for taking a full page screenshot, right? Or I want a screenshot of the whole page. So it needs access to every page. But I don't know what else it's doing. I hope it's fine. I should probably double check. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, I have a bunch of extensions installed. You pointed out one that we just started using that requests global permissions. And I didn't even know that at first. And, we've spent years socializing people to the consent forms for OAuth flows and good consent forms and how to read them and how to make sure you know what's happening. And browser extensions present this whole other, consent issue that's kind of along the same lines. The browser extension tells you very briefly what it's going to have access to, and you invariably say allow, and then you kind of forget about it. And from the perspective of publishing, I just had this experience where I published a browser extension called the implicit flow detector. And its whole point in life is to alert you, the user, when you're on a website that's using outmoded OAuth flows. But I needed to request kind of global permissions because I needed to inspect the URL, and I needed to do that in a potentially blocking way. So I basically asked for very broad permissions, and I was very surprised. It got approval without any kind of like back and forth, without any kind of questioning. It got approval on Firefox's add-ons website in about 15 minutes, and it got approval on the Google Chrome Web Store in about 24 hours. So I have no idea what kind of review process they're doing, but it's pretty easy to get a browser extension posted that has very broad permissions associated with it. So, just something to look. And in this particular case, I would say the implicit flow detector is a legitimate browser extension, and I'm promising that it's not doing anything untoward with the information that it pulls out. But and the source code is open source, so you could go look at it. But who has the time to do that? And also, you know, it's just one of these things where sometimes we exchange security for convenience. But it is a worthwhile endeavor. I'm just looking at my browser toolbar. I would say I have about 10 extensions. It's a worthwhile endeavor to go and do a little audit of those extensions and see what they have access to.
Yeah, for sure. Let's change topics a little bit, although it's very closely related. So this question from Luca. For single-page apps, I've seen that many libraries save access tokens in session or local storage, but I've read somewhere that the most secure place is just in memory. What would you recommend? So yeah, I say this is closely related to that discussion because it overlaps with the browser extension permission issue as well. So the one of the core problems with single-page apps and OAuth, or really any form of access control, is that there really isn't a secure storage API in browsers at all. So on mobile phones, for example, there is a API especially for storing secure stuff, like storing secrets. And the application can put stuff there, and then the application can't even access it until the application asks the user for like Face ID or Touch ID or whatever biometrics to unlock the storage, and then it can read the data. So that's like, and much less like apps can't access each other's data at all on iPhone, right? So on top of that, there's also the restriction of an app can store stuff in a way that even the app can't get to. So that's great. That means we can use that for all sorts of fun stuff, like storing access tokens and refresh tokens, and that doesn't exist in browsers. So I'm waiting for the day that someone implements a secure storage API in browsers that's protected by the same biometrics that are in all the computers now, because laptops are getting biometrics as well, and it's got browser support with OAuth now. So like all the building blocks are there, and it's a lot better than it was. But there's still no JavaScript API for it, which means if your single page app gets an access token and it's trying to use it, it has to keep it around somewhere. And there isn't a secure storage, so there's only just whatever's available. So that's going to be, it keeps it around in memory, just in a variable. It keeps it around in, it keeps it like in local storage or in a cookie or in any of the other storage APIs. The problem with the storage APIs is that any other JavaScript on the page can access them, and extensions can also run in the page and then access them, right? So if you've got, so the other, I just realized one of the other vectors for stealing authorization codes beyond extensions is third-party JavaScripts. Did I just freeze? There we go. I think my computer's acting up.
You did for a sec.
Third-party JavaScript on the page. So when people build websites, they often are using third-party libraries, either pulled in and like repackaged or hot-linked to CDNs, or completely external stuff like your Google Analytics scripts or your ad tracking networks or that kind of thing. And all of that stuff that's running on the page has a lot of access to things in your own application, depending on cores and things. But one of the things it does have access to very easily is the address bar. So any of that code in the website can access the address bar, which means it can steal authorization codes. So the other way we could have demonstrated this attack was to package up a utility as a JavaScript tool that's available from our CDN, and then use that in a web page. Maybe that utility is like, well, your cat example, right? Like, show me a fun cat fact. Right. Could put a little cat crawling around on the bottom of the web page. That'd be cute, right? if you want to embed an Easter egg in your website and it's got a little cat crawling around, drop in the script tag on your web page, and now your visitors will see cats. But also, that script would be looking for authorization codes and funneling them out somewhere. And that's not something that the users have any control over. It is something that the website owners can audit, but have you really audited all of the JavaScripts that you're including in your websites when you're building them? And I mean all of it. Like, have you looked through the Google Analytics JavaScript source code? Have you looked through whatever ad networks you're using? Like, there's a lot of stuff in there. So that's one way to steal authorization codes.
There's been a couple of things with NPM recently, right? Where there's been like poison libraries that, you know, it turns out hundreds of thousands of people are using in their apps.
Yep, and with continuous deployment and continuous integration, it turns out it's actually very easy for those to get deployed, because if someone can publish an update to one of those packages, it might very well just start getting baked into websites as they roll out updates without anybody knowing. So tying this back to the saving access tokens in single page apps, it's all the same problems again. Like, any of that stuff could have access to local storage or your session storage or whatever it is. And yeah, it's always a risk there. Until there's a secure, like, domain-bound storage API. Storing it in memory is definitely potentially safer because it's a lot harder for one of those scripts to, like, poke around in memory. It would probably have to be a more targeted attack, which is always, you know, less of a risk, because these attacks tend to, like, for one of these attacks to be successful, they probably are going to be just trying to attack as many websites as they can as fast as they can. And scanning local storage for access tokens is very easy to do on anybody's website, whereas poking around memory is a lot harder and would take more knowledge of your particular app. The other technique I've seen is keeping the OAuth exchange and the access tokens out of the JavaScript entirely and in a service worker, in a web worker. And the reason for doing that is because there is a very hard line between those two parts of a website. So the JavaScript in the DOM can't access anything that the web worker is doing, because they're meant to be running in separate processes. And like on a phone, your web worker can run even when the browser is closed if you've installed it as a progressive web app on Android, things like that, right? So if you keep the access token and the whole OAuth exchange out of the DOM and only in the web worker, then now you've protected it from extensions and third-party scripts. That comes with a few challenges in terms of now you have to route every API request through the web worker, including token refreshes and all of that. It's definitely doable, it's possible, but that's probably the safest I've seen for single-page apps. Again, nothing's perfect, but no security is perfect.
Yeah, and one of the things we come back to a lot, it ends up being the punchline of these conversations, is if it's at all possible for you to have middleware, if there isn't a hard requirement for your SPA app to have tokens, the safest security footing is to keep the tokens up in your .NET or your Spring Boot or your PHP app, keep them up there, just use the normal session mechanisms to interact between your SPA app and your middleware, and then your SPA app never has to have a token and deal with any of these problems. That's not always possible, but I would say much of the time, at least in customers and other people that I've encountered, there's almost always middleware. So, you know, does your SPA app really need to have tokens stored in it is a valid question. And oftentimes, when you dig a little, the answer is no. It really doesn't have to have the token there. It can just interact with the middleware, let the middleware make the API call, and just ferry the results back down to the SPA app.
Yep. So here, I'm going to grab this one really quick. So from Yusef, how come I don't have to tell Okta my client secret when using OAuth from the front end only? It seems insecure. And this is using the sign-in widget JavaScript. So this is why Pixie is important. And if you did use a secret in JavaScript, a client secret in JavaScript, it wouldn't be secret anymore, because in order to deploy that application, you would have to bundle that secret into the application, which is then shipped to all your users, and then anybody who visits your website would be able to go and look at the secret. So it would no longer be secret, and then they could do way worse things. So you can't use a secret with JavaScript. Same with mobile apps. That's just not possible because it's no longer a secret. So the question is then, how do you do the OAuth exchange without a secret? And if you just drop the secret...
Could I interject real quick?
Yeah.
So, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to interject real quick. This seems like an Okta specific question, but it really really isn't. It's speaking to OAuth in general. So continue on.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, this applies to all OAuth. So if you just removed the client secret from that exchange, then yeah, that is less secure. Because the problem is then the OAuth server issues that authorization code, that temporary authorization code to the application. And like we said at the beginning, it can't ever really be sure that it got there, and it can't be sure that it wasn't stolen, because anything that can watch the address bar could steal it. And without the client secret, the authorization code would be all that's needed to get an access token, and that would be bad. So instead, what we do is we add PKCE, and that adds back in this security, which is that the app has to actually make up something at the beginning, and then when it goes to use the authorization code, it includes that thing. So that means that because that isn't actually sent in the first part, if someone did steal the authorization code out of the URL, they can't use it anymore because they can't have also stolen the thing at the beginning of the flow. Not enough time to get into how actually PKCE works, but we have plenty of videos on PKCE. Go search this channel and search for, I talk about it in several of my talks. The How to Hack OAuth talk has a walkthrough of it. Any of the, so if you're interested in actually how PKCE works. But that's how to protect JavaScript apps using the authorization code flow.
And this is, oh good, I was just going to put that up. It's related.
Yeah. So Jonathan says, does it look like OAuth 3 or OAuth 2.1 will address any of the vulnerabilities we've been discussing, for instance, with authorization codes? And so before I answer this, I just want to say, first of all, OAuth 3 doesn't exist yet. Right now, it's sort of the unofficial code name for an effort by technically a different working group, although a lot of the same people in the OAuth working group, to do something that's completely different from OAuth 2. It's completely up for grabs. Who knows how it'll turn out? Like, the name hasn't even been decided yet. OAuth 2.1 is also not officially a thing yet, but it's a lot closer and has a lot more buy-in right now. However, it is still an individual draft, which means it is not yet adopted by the OAuth working group, so it doesn't really have any official standing yet. But there is a push towards that, and we're working on it. The idea with OAuth 2.1 is that it basically takes OAuth 2 and all the best practices of how to do this securely, packages it up as this new name. So we're not actually changing anything. We're just saying, if you follow OAuth 2.0 to the best implementation possible, as we know right now, that is what OAuth 2.1 is. And one of the things in there is the idea that, yeah, you need to protect this authorization code. And to do that, you can use PKCE. So that just sort of becomes how it works. So there would not be the option of the authorization code flow with no client secret without PKCE. That won't be a possibility in OAuth 2.1, whereas that is a possibility in 2.0 right now. So the answer is yes. The other answer, so that's 2.1. The other answer with OAuth 3 or whatever the eventual name is that effort is basically completely reimagining how this all works, and to also avoid these problems at the source. So what we're doing with 2.1 and 2.0 is we're taking, like, okay, we've got this stuff deployed, like tons of companies have written code and software and libraries. We don't want to just say, like, all that's scrapped, like, go do this differently now. We do want to tell people how to best secure it, and that's 2.1. OAuth 3 is saying, what if we didn't have to worry about compatibility? What if we weren't even trying to be compatible with OAuth 2? So it's doing things very, very differently, a lot of which is inspired by the particular problems of things like using redirect URLs or using these temporary authorization codes and passing them around in the way that they are in OAuth 2.0. Anything you want to add to that, Micah? Oh yeah, OAuth.xyz. Thanks for dropping that in the chat. OAuth.xyz is the website for the proposal for this new potentially OAuth 3 or whatever the name ends up being. It's one of the proposals on the table. There's another one that's documented as well. So, you know, it's a whole thing going on. Don't know how this is going to turn out yet.
Would you say, Aaron, with OAuth 2.1, if it follows kind of a normal, you know, sort of standards track, would you say that that's like 1 to 3 years away from being like, you know, an actual spec? Is that like, I know we can't say very specifically, but is that coarse enough to say like 1 to 3 years away?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why it's impossible to predict an actual timeline. The main reason is because everybody who's working in this is working on their own schedules and with whatever time they have available at their jobs or personally. So the speed at which this stuff progresses is very much dependent on the individuals who are part of the group. There is no sort of like overarching milestones or deadlines or you know, project manager. Plus the fact that it is a long process. It's been about 6 months already that we've had this OAuth 2.1 effort. It's reasonably far along. There's still a lot more work to do. I would say 1 to 3 years is definitely a broad enough guess that that's a good estimate. And I do think that it does have enough support already that it will probably happen, as opposed to you know, other efforts in the group even that are like in the works where we don't even know if they have enough support to even happen at the end. So yeah, I would even be willing to be on the optimistic side of that. Like I think a year. I'm shooting for a year.
Nice. Yeah. Well, yeah. So first of all, that's awesome, and second of all, the point I was trying to make is that whatever the next, like, let's say major iteration of OAuth is, whether it's called OAuth 3 or something else, whenever there's like a radical departure from what we're currently doing, it's probably even farther out than that. Like OAuth 2.1,
yeah,
we would expect to happen probably a lot sooner than, you know, working title OAuth 3 or whatever it becomes. So, you know, for anybody that's looking for you know, something radical or different, it's probably even further off than you know, OAuth 2.1 and the security BCP for OAuth 2. Those are all just like trying to plug the current holes that are out in the wild that we know about.
Yep, exactly. Thanks.
We got about 2 minutes left. What should we hit on?
2 minutes. Let me grab this last question. So in the new browser-based app spec, it's one of the ones I'm working on in the group. It says you must either set a maximum lifetime on refresh tokens or expire them if it has not been used within some amount of time, as part 2. The latter does not seem sufficient when dealing with compromised or malicious clients, as they could keep refreshing indefinitely. Should a maximum lifetime always be set, ideally? So the idea with that is to limit, because this is in a browser and because there's not a perfect solution in browsers, the idea with that clause there is to limit the risk of what happens if a refresh token is leaked. So it actually says something in addition to that, which is, it's not just that it has a maximum lifetime or expires, it's also that they're one-time use. And that's the real important one. So that's really what makes it a little bit safer, is that if they're one-time use, you can imagine that if someone stole one, but the real app also still had it, if the real app uses it and then the attacker uses it, or the other way around, then the authorization server knows something went wrong and can shut the whole thing down. So that's the part that actually makes it a little bit safer to use refresh tokens in single page apps. The maximum lifetime thing is there, I think, just to, again, limit the risk of this, but it's always a risk assessment, right? Like everything is, you have to decide how much risk you're willing to tolerate and then make those decisions accordingly. and this spec is saying, here are some recommendations that the industry agrees on for this particular environment. Cool. Oh, that takes us to the top of the hour. That went by faster than I thought. We got into a good groove there. Closing remarks. Come back next week. We'll be doing this again, same time next week.
Yes.
And hopefully have some more fun things to show. Take a look at OAuth.net, of course. That's a good resource for finding a lot more of these paths for the experiments and new RFCs that are coming up. OAuth.xyz is a good place to dive into the brand new OAuth 3, whatever that name ends up being, work, and get involved in the group. Like, it's totally fine to jump on the mailing list and share your opinions. There's a naming discussion going on right now for that new group. It's working on the potential OAuth 3. So if you have any opinions on the name for that group, this is the time to chime in. And again, if you just follow the links from, I think it's linked from OAuth.xyz, you'll find it. So thank you all very much for joining, and see you next week.
See you next week.